In today's video, we're counting down these wild animals invaded cities and mauled people alive. Got it. From a Mumbai man stepping into a familiar stairwell only to face a hidden leopard, to a young woman in Addis Ababa caught in the path of a hyena pack at the city's edge, these are the moments where curiosity, habit, and misjudgment collided with nature's most dangerous predators. It was October 14, 2016 in Mumbai, where the tail end of the monsoon season had left the city in a state of perpetual dampness that refused to lift even as the calendar pushed toward the cooler months. The air carried the particular heaviness that settles over dense urban environments after prolonged rain, a mixture of wet concrete, open drains, street food smoke, and the faint chemical smell of the city's older infrastructure slowly absorbing moisture and releasing it back into the atmosphere. The sky that evening had been overcast since late afternoon, pressing down on the city's skyline in a flat gray sheet that turned the streets below into a maze of orange sodium glow and deep shadow. Mumbai is a city of layers. Its oldest residential neighborhoods stack families on top of families in buildings constructed decades ago, with little thought for the pressures they would eventually bear. The apartment block where Arjun Mehta lived was one of those structures, a 6-story building with exterior walls repainted so many times the surface had developed a texture of its own, and a central stairwell that served as the single artery connecting every floor to the street below. There was no elevator. The stairwell was simply part of life in that building, used dozens of times a day by residents carrying groceries, children, laundry, and everything else that daily existence in a dense urban neighborhood requires. Arjun Mehta was 32 years old and had lived in that building for several years. He worked long hours in a job that demanded early starts and late finishes, and his neighbors knew him primarily as a quiet presence, someone who nodded in passing, kept his space tidy, and rarely lingered in common areas for conversation. He was not unfriendly, simply focused, the kind of person whose life ran on a tight schedule that left little room for deviation. He used the stairwell the way everyone in that building used it, automatically, without thought, the way people navigate spaces they have moved through hundreds of times before. In daylight, the stairwell was unremarkable. At night, with the overhead bulbs flickering or absent, it was darker than most people from outside the neighborhood would have expected, but to residents, it was simply familiar. What made Mumbai's situation with leopards unusual and genuinely dangerous in ways outsiders rarely appreciated was not that leopards occasionally wandered in from surrounding forests. It was that leopards had established themselves as a functioning part of Mumbai's ecosystem, moving through the city's green corridors, drainage channels, and construction gaps with a regularity that wildlife researchers had been documenting for years. The animals fed primarily on the city's enormous population of stray dogs, which gave them a reliable food source requiring no confrontation with humans, and allowed them to operate almost entirely under cover of darkness. Most Mumbai residents near the national park on the city's northern edge were aware, in a general sense, that leopards existed nearby. But awareness and genuine comprehension of what that proximity meant were two different things. In the days before October 14th, a wildlife camera had captured footage of a leopard moving through a corridor between two residential buildings. The footage had been noted by wildlife officials, but the animal had not been captured or relocated. It continued moving through the urban landscape as it had been doing, following routes that passed through drainage channels, along compound walls, and occasionally through the lower floors of buildings where gaps in security allowed access. That evening, a power outage struck the building and the surrounding block. The cause was unremarkable, the kind of infrastructure failure that happens regularly in older parts of the city after sustained rain. The stairwell went completely dark. Residents who needed to descend had two options: wait for power to return, or navigate the stairs using whatever ambient light filtered in from outside windows. The leopard had entered the building sometime before the outage. Wildlife investigators would later piece together the most likely sequence. The animal had been moving through the area when it encountered a group of stray dogs that cornered it in a narrow passage between buildings. Unable to retreat along its usual route, it pushed through an unsecured ground floor access point and moved upward through the building's interior. With the stairwell open and no human movement during the outage, the leopard continued upward in search of a quieter refuge. By the time the commotion outside settled, the animal had reached the third-floor landing and pressed itself into the corner where the stairwell wall met the landing railing. It was not hunting. It was doing what cornered animals do: waiting, still, alert, and coiled with the tension of an animal that has been pushed into a space with no clear exit. Arjun came down the stairs sometime after the outage began. He was moving at a normal pace, one hand trailing the wall for orientation. He had no reason to move cautiously. He had descended those stairs hundreds of times. He had no knowledge of the footage captured days earlier. No reason to connect a power outage to the presence of a large predator on a landing he was about to step onto. By the time he reached the third floor, he was within a few meters of the leopard. The distance matters enormously. Leopards are ambush predators built for explosive, close-range engagement. Animals whose entire physical architecture is optimized for the moment of contact rather than the pursuit that precedes it. At a few meters, in complete darkness, with a figure moving directly toward it and no room to retreat, the leopard's response was not a decision. It was a reflex shaped by millions of years of survival behavior. There was a shift in the darkness, subtle, fast, and already too close to process. The animal launched forward and drove its attack at the neck and face, the precise targeting leopards use instinctively to neutralize a threat, the same targeting they use when taking down prey in the wild. Arjun collapsed on the landing. The injuries to his neck were severe and immediate, severing vessels that could not be compressed or controlled in the darkness of a stairwell, with no one nearby to respond. Blood loss progressed rapidly, and by the time other residents became aware that something had happened, the outcome was effectively sealed within minutes. The city's quiet corridors and human density were a far cry from open landscapes, but the danger of large wildlife was not confined to India's megacities. It was March 3, 2017, in Chiang Mai, where the dry season had settled over the region with relentless pressing heat that turned the surrounding countryside into a landscape of cracked soil and brittle vegetation. The rains were months away, and the air carried dust from unpaved roads on the outskirts and the faint sweetness of fruit ripening too fast in the heat. The roadside markets that lined the corridors connecting outer villages to the city's edge operated under canvas canopies that provided shelter without doing much to reduce the heat beneath them. Niran Chayaporn had worked one of those roadside stalls for years. He was 45 years old, and the stall was his primary livelihood. A modest but functional operation selling produce and household goods to the steady stream of locals and workers who passed through each day. He had built the business through consistency and stubbornness in equal measure, showing up before dawn to set out his goods and staying until the last afternoon customers had moved on. Neighbors and fellow vendors along the strip knew him as someone who did not yield easily to pressure of any kind. The stall was not just income. It was the product of years of effort, and he treated it with the protective instinct that people develop toward things they have built themselves. The reports had started coming in early that morning. A lone bull elephant had been moving through agricultural land along the outskirts of Chiang Mai, leaving significant damage behind. Crops flattened, fencing destroyed, storage structures overturned. Wildlife officials were tracking the animal, but the terrain was difficult and the elephant was moving faster than expected, following a corridor that ran roughly parallel to the main road before intersecting with it. The animal was in must. This is a physiological condition specific to bull elephants, triggered by a dramatic increase in testosterone that can elevate hormone levels to many times their normal concentration. The physical signs are visible. Temporal glands swell and secrete a dark, oily fluid, and the animal's behavior shifts in unmistakable ways. Must does not make an elephant aggressive the way fear or pain does. It creates a state of sustained, hormonally driven agitation in which the animal's threshold for perceived threat drops dramatically, and its response to any challenge becomes disproportionate and sustained. Wildlife managers treat must animals as a category apart because the normal rules of elephant behavior do not apply in the same way. By the time the elephant reached the roadside market strip, most people had already received some warning through word of mouth or the sounds of the animal's approach. The response was almost universal. Vendors abandoned their stalls. Customers moved away from the road, and the strip cleared with the speed of a crowd that has collectively decided staying is not an option. Niran did not leave. He positioned himself in front of his stall, facing the animal as it moved along the road toward his section of the market. He began shouting and throwing objects in the elephant's direction, an attempt to drive the animal away from the goods and structure he had spent years building. It was not an irrational impulse. People have driven elephants away from property using noise and projectiles in many parts of Southeast Asia, and under normal circumstances, with a non-must animal, such tactics can sometimes work. These were not normal circumstances. To a bull elephant in must, a human standing its ground, shouting and throwing objects, does not register as a deterrent. It registers as a direct challenge, the precise category of stimulus that must is biologically designed to respond to with maximum force. The elephant charged. The animal covered the distance in seconds, moving with the deceptive speed that makes elephant charges so difficult to survive even when anticipated. It drove Niran against the concrete wall of a structure at the back of his stall with the full weight of its body. But it did not stop there. It brought its weight down repeatedly in the trampling pattern that characterizes the most severe elephant attacks, a behavior driven not by predatory instinct but by the must-amplified drive to completely neutralize a perceived rival. The injuries were not survivable. The elephant moved on through the market strip, continuing along the road corridor before wildlife officials were eventually able to redirect it away from populated areas later that afternoon. From the streets of Southeast Asia to the waterlines of the Americas, human settlements frequently overlap with apex predators whose instincts remain unchanged. It was July 22, 2015 in Miami, where a week of heavy summer, rain had pushed water levels across the city's extensive canal network well above their normal seasonal lines. The storms had come in off the Atlantic in the way South Florida storms do, fast, heavy, and relentless, dropping large amounts of water in short periods and overwhelming drainage systems already operating near capacity. By the time the rain eased, the canals running behind residential neighborhoods had risen noticeably, their banks narrowed and in some places submerged, blurring the line between water and land. The neighborhoods built along Miami's residential canals occupy a particular geography. one where the boundary between human space and aquatic habitat is defined by a few feet of grass and a concrete edge rather than any meaningful barrier. The canals were engineered features, carved through what had been wetland and marsh, and the wildlife that had inhabited those wetlands had not disappeared when development arrived. American crocodiles had been a documented presence in canal systems connected to the coastal waterways of southern Miami, particularly where brackish conditions extended inland, and long-term residents had developed a working familiarity with the animals, knowing not to approach the water at night, knowing to keep pets away from the canal edge, knowing that the dark water held things not always visible from the bank. Marcus Reed was 28 years old and had grown up in Florida. His relationship with the state's wildlife was shaped by familiarity rather than fear. He had been around crocodiles his entire life, aware of them, respectful in a general sense, but not actively cautious in the way that someone encountering them for the first time might be. The canal behind his neighborhood was simply part of the landscape, a feature he had lived alongside without incident for long enough that it had stopped registering as a source of risk. What the heavy rains had done, beyond raising water levels, was fundamentally alter the distribution of crocodiles throughout the connected waterway system. Crocodiles move through water with ease and follow channels wherever they lead, and the elevated water levels had opened access to residential canals that would normally have been too shallow or disconnected to attract large animals. The banks of those channels, lower than usual, partially submerged, brought a crocodile's effective hunting range directly to the edge of people's backyards. Crocodiles are ambush predators in the most complete sense. Their hunting strategy is built entirely around patience and concealment, lying motionless near a shoreline with only eyes and nostrils breaking the surface, waiting for prey to approach close enough to make a strike viable. They do not chase. They wait for the moment when distance collapses to the point where an explosive lunge can close the gap before the prey has any realistic chance of reacting. Late that night, Marcus approached the canal bank to retrieve something he had dropped near the edge. When he got there, he crouched at the waterline. The act of crouching brought him lower, closer to the water's surface, and the movement sent vibrations through the ground. The precise sensory inputs that a crocodile positioned near the bank had been waiting for. The animal had been there, motionless, for some time before Marcus arrived. It was a large male, positioned close to the bank, in the way crocodiles do when in hunting mode, patient, invisible, and ready. The elevated water level had brought it within striking range of the bank without requiring it to move onto dry ground at all. The lunge came without warning, as crocodile strikes always do. The animal exploded from the water and clamped onto his shoulder and upper arm, immediately pulling backward into the canal with the full power of its tail and hindquarters. Once Marcus was in the water, the crocodile performed a death roll, a rapid, full-body rotation that disorients, causes catastrophic tearing of soft tissue at the point of the bite, and uses the animal's body weight and rotational momentum to subdue resistance. The death roll is not a learned behavior or a tactical choice. It is a fixed action pattern, triggered automatically once the animal has secured a grip on prey in the water. Marcus drowned within minutes. The canal, a familiar and unremarkable feature of his neighborhood, had become the environment in which an apex predator held every possible advantage. Not every encounter occurs on land. In Addis Ababa, the urban margins themselves became a stage where carnivores had adapted to life alongside people. It was January 11, 2018, in Addis Ababa, where the pre-dawn hours brought a cold that caught visitors off guard, but was entirely familiar to anyone who had spent a winter in the city. Addis Ababa sits at an elevation that gives it a climate unlike the rest of Ethiopia, cool nights even in the dry season and mornings that begin in a darkness that feels heavier than it does at lower altitudes. At 4 in the morning, the streets on the outer edges of the city were quiet in the way large cities are quiet before the first wave of workers begins to move, stripped of daytime noise, leaving behind only the sounds that belong to the city's margins. Selam Tesfaye was 19 years old. She made the same walk most mornings before the city fully woke, moving through a route established through repetition, the kind of path that develops when someone walks the same way enough times that it stops being a choice and becomes simply the way things are done. The route passed near one of the large open waste sites on the urban fringe, a sprawling area where the city's garbage accumulated in quantities that reflected the scale of the population producing it. She was known to those around her as self-sufficient and purposeful, someone who moved through her days with the focused energy of a person who understood that her circumstances required consistent effort and left little room for distraction. The waste site was not an incidental feature of the landscape. It was a functioning ecosystem in its own right, and at the center of that ecosystem were spotted hyenas. Spotted hyenas in Addis Ababa represent one of the most studied examples of large carnivore adaptation to urban environments anywhere in the world. The animals had been moving into the city's outskirts for generations, drawn initially by the food resources human settlements produce, and eventually becoming so habituated to human presence that they operated within the city's boundaries with a confidence unthinkable for a large predator in most other urban contexts. They were not shy. They had learned, over many generations of exposure, that humans in their environment were not a threat, and that the waste sites those humans produced were a reliable and abundant food source. In the weeks leading up to January 11th, conditions at the waste site had shifted. Food scarcity had elevated tension among the hyenas that used the site, making the animals more aggressive and more willing to engage with anything that approached their feeding area. The boldness that habituation had already produced was being amplified by hunger. A group of hyenas was actively feeding at the site when Selam passed nearby in the pre-dawn darkness. When she became aware of their presence close to her path, she did what instinct and experience suggested. She began backing away. It was the right response. The problem was the ground between her and safety. The area around the waste site was uneven, cluttered with debris, broken by the edges of discarded materials and the ruts left by service vehicles. As Selam moved backward, she caught her footing on something in the dark and fell. The effect of that fall was immediate and decisive. Hyenas are extraordinarily attuned to vulnerability. Their entire evolutionary history, as both hunters and scavengers, has sharpened their ability to distinguish between prey capable of resistance and prey that is not. A standing human, even one backing away, registers as potentially capable of defense. A human on the ground registers differently. The fall changed the calculation. A low, rumbling sound carried through the darkness, the signal that the first animal was deciding how to act. Then it moved, approaching with the cautious, testing behavior hyenas use when assessing a situation they have not yet committed to. Others followed, reading the first animal's advance as a signal that the assessment had shifted. Once the group began to engage, the pack-feeding behavior that makes hyena attacks so devastating took over, teeth and jaws working in coordinated strikes, each animal reacting to the other's movements in a chain of rapid escalation. Their jaws generate some of the highest bite forces of any land carnivore, capable of crushing bone. And when a group feeds together, speed and intensity escalates rapidly as each animal's behavior reinforces the others. Selam could not regain her footing in time. Blood loss and trauma to the neck and limbs progressed faster than any help could reach her in the pre-dawn darkness at the edge of the city. Even in the mountains of North America, where humans often believe they understand wildlife, rare but deadly encounters can happen when experience meets an unpredictable, food-conditioned predator. It was September 9, 2018, in Aspen, where the first real edge of autumn had begun to assert itself over the mountain landscape. Not gradually, but with a sudden clarity that arrives overnight and transforms the quality of the air and the color of the light. The aspen groves had started their seasonal turn, patches of gold appearing among the green along the ridgelines and spreading downslope toward the residential neighborhoods that pressed up against the wilderness on the town's edges. The nights had grown sharp and cold, carrying the smell of pine resin and dry leaves. Daniel Brooks was 54 years old and had lived in the area long enough to consider himself genuinely familiar with the rhythms of mountain life, including its wildlife. He was known among his neighbors as steady and self-assured, someone who had spent years in bear country and had developed the kind of confidence that comes from long experience without serious incident. He had seen bears before, navigated the standard precautions mountain living required, and did not consider himself careless or uninformed about the risks. The black bear that had been working his neighborhood for the preceding weeks was a different kind of problem. This animal had become what wildlife managers call food-conditioned, a specific and serious behavioral shift in which a bear has learned, through repeated successful experience, to associate human residential spaces with reliable food. The mechanism is straightforward. A bear investigates a trash bin, finds food, and returns. Over time, the behavior becomes habitual, and the bear's natural caution around human spaces erodes in proportion to the number of successful feeding events it has accumulated. Food-conditioned bears are one of the most persistent wildlife management challenges in mountain communities across the American West. The behavior, once established, is extremely difficult to reverse because the animal has already learned that the reward is worth the risk. Wildlife managers had been aware of the bear's activity in the neighborhood and had issued warnings about securing bins, but the animal had continued to find access. The bear had been to Daniel's property before. On the night of September 9th, it was back again, working through the unsecured bins in the darkness behind the house. Daniel went outside after dark and came around the corner of the house to encounter the bear at close range while the animal was actively feeding. The bear's initial response was a bluff charge, a rapid forward rush that stops short of contact, designed to intimidate and drive away a perceived threat. Bluff charges are common in close-range surprise encounters, the bear's way of communicating that it wants the threat to leave. For someone who backs away slowly and gives the animal space, a bluff charge does not have to become something worse. Daniel did not back away. He held his ground and shouted, an assertion of dominance that, at distance with a bear that has a clear escape route, can sometimes work. At close range, in the dark, with no clear escape route and a prior food reward reinforcing boldness, the bluff charge escalated into a direct attack. The bear's ears flattened and a low growl rumbled from its throat, a final warning that came and went in the same instant before the strike. The bear's forepaw slammed into him, knocking him to the ground and setting him up for the defensive bites that followed. The bear's bites and clawing caused trauma to the head and upper body that was rapidly fatal. By the time the bear disengaged and moved away from the property, what Daniel had sustained was not survivable. Across the globe, the lessons of human-wildlife interaction remain consistent. Proximity, curiosity, and misjudgment can carry fatal consequences. In northeastern India, along a road cutting through tiger territory, the same principle applied. It was December 2, 2017, near the boundary of a national park in the northeastern region of India, where the winter nights arrived early and with a cold that settled quickly over the landscape once the sun dropped below the tree line. The highway that cut through the park's buffer zone was a road that existed in a complicated relationship with the wilderness on either side of it. A human infrastructure corridor running through territory that belonged, in every meaningful ecological sense, to the animals that had inhabited it long before the road was built. Ravi Kumar was 38 years old and drove that stretch of road regularly as part of his work. He was not an outsider to the region or its wildlife. He was someone who paid attention to the animals around him, who was aware of the significance of the territory he moved through, and who had a genuine interest in the wildlife that made the area notable. In the days before December 2nd, reports had been circulating among locals and drivers that a tiger had been seen near the road on multiple occasions. The sightings were not unusual in themselves. Tigers moved through the buffer zone regularly. What made the reports more concerning was a detail noted by more than one person who had seen the animal. It appeared to be moving with a limp. The behavioral implications of an injury in a large predator are significant and well understood. A healthy tiger is an efficient hunter, capable of taking down large prey through stealth and explosive speed. An injured tiger is a different animal, one whose ability to hunt efficiently has been compromised, whose energy expenditure per successful kill has increased, and whose tolerance for risk has shifted accordingly. Hunger compresses the threshold at which a predator will take chances it would otherwise avoid. An injured tiger near a road at night in a region with a history of human-wildlife conflict represented a specific and elevated category of risk, distinct from the general risk of tiger presence in the area. Ravi stopped his vehicle along the road that night. The tiger was visible near the roadside vegetation, close enough to observe, close enough to film. He stepped out of the vehicle and moved toward the animal, closing the distance to approximately 10 meters. The decision reflected a failure to translate general awareness of wildlife into specific situational judgment about risk. 10 meters is not a safe distance from a large predator under any circumstances. It is well within the range at which a tiger can close the gap before a human can react, and it is a distance at which an injured animal, operating under the pressure of compromised hunting ability and elevated hunger, has no reason to treat a human figure as anything other than a threat that has come too close. The tiger launched from the vegetation in the short, explosive ambush burst that big cats use for close-range kills. It did not need to build speed over distance. The distance was already gone. The attack targeted the neck, the instinctive point of engagement for a predator whose killing mechanism is built around cervical trauma. The bite was delivered with the full force of an adult tiger's jaw musculature, and the cervical injuries it caused were immediately catastrophic. Ravi collapsed at the roadside. The nearest help was not close, and the time required for anyone to reach him was longer than the injuries allowed. He died at the edge of the road, in the buffer zone between the highway and the wilderness, 10 meters from the vehicle he had stepped out of to get a better look.